before we go ahead, let me introduce brief about the author, Mr. Dr. Seshadri Chari. So before we go ahead, let me introduce brief about the author, Mr. Dr. Seshadri Chari. So before we go ahead, let me introduce brief about the author, Mr. Dr. Seshadri Chari. So before we go ahead, let me introduce brief about the author, Mr. Dr. Seshadri Chari. As a consultant, we go ahead, let me introduce brief about the author, Mr. Dr. Seshadri Chari. As a consultant, we go ahead, let me introduce brief about the author, Mr. Dr. Seshadri Chari. As a consultant, we go ahead, let me introduce brief about the author, regional dynamics, Seshadri Chari. As a consultant, regional dynamics, regional dynamics, prosecution to the future of prosperity. All about the Jews' atrocity to the new avenue. Prosecution to the future of prosperity. All about the Jews' atrocity to the new avenue. Prosecution to the future of prosperity. All about the Jews' atrocity to the new avenue. Prosecution to the future of prosperity. All about the Jews' atrocity to the new avenue. Prosecution to the future of prosperity. All about the Jews' atrocity to the new avenue. Prosecution to the future of prosperity. All about the Jews' atrocity to the new avenue. Prosecution to the future of prosperity. All about the Jews' atrocity to the new avenue. Prosecution to the future of prosperity. All about the Jews' atrocity to the new avenue. Prosecution to the future of prosperity. All about the Jews' atrocity to the new avenue. Prosecution to the future of prosperity. All about the Jews' atrocity to the new avenue.
Society as well as at the official level in Israel as a country. And Professor Chari has made an immense contribution to the historiography and to understanding the Indo-Israel relationship. So I'd like to start off by addressing my first question to Dr. Chari. And sir, what is it that led you to write this book? Why pick the Saga of Israel?
Thank you, sir. Thank you for those kind words and introduction. Actually, it was quite a unexpected question, I should say. Usually, authors are asked, how did you promote this book and how much did you sell? And usually the authors don't reply unless they confirm that the person asking is not an income tax officer. So here I don't have to worry about two things. One, I know your background, and secondly, this book is not priced at all. And that is where I wish to say why I chose this subject. There was a little bit of fascination about the subject for a long time for me.
Professor Chari has made
I used
an
to
immense contribution to the historiography and to understanding the Indo-Israel relationship.
I would like to study fascination, like to study the subject for a long time for me.
Professor Chari has
evolution
made an immense contribution to the historiography and to understanding the Indo-Israel relationship.
We have like to study fascination, like to study the subject for a long. Very, very great civilizations which have evolved into nations. Like when we say about our own country, we say we have a very ancient civilization and a nation. Of course, people say that we became a nation in 1947, but it was not that we became a nation in 1947. We were there long before all these things. So basically, when we were studying about the evolution of nations, one thing that became very important is to understand the definition of nationhood. So we understand the definition of nationhood from various concepts. So many Western scholars have written on the evolution of nation and the definition of nationhood. So one of the most accepted definition is there are four elements which are important for a nation. One, no government. There was no government of Israel in exile, like so many other countries have today. So there was no geography, no set of people, no government, obviously no sovereignty, like so many other countries. But still they called themselves a 4,000 year old. So there was no geography, no set of people, no government, obviously no sovereignty, like so many other countries. But still they called themselves a 4,000 so there was no geography, no set of people, no government, obviously no sovereignty, like definition. So but still they called. So that is what intrigued themselves. Why they so there was no geography, no set of people, no government, obviously no sovereignty. Definition. So but still they called. So this actually gave. So that is what intrigued themselves. Why they so there was no geography, no set of people, no government, no sovereignty. Definition. So but still they called. So this. So that is what intrigued themselves. Why they so there was no geography, no set of people, no government, definition. So but still they call. So this has scripted. So that is what intrigued themselves. Why they no geography, no set of people, no government, definition. So where does they call like this has scripted. So that is what intrigued themselves. Why they no geography, no set of people.
If I may, sir, if you could just then please elucidate on that point. I know that earlier in our conversation you made a reference to this. You spoke of perhaps the kernel or the seed wherein this nation springs from, something called cultural reference to this term that you use. So if I may, perhaps explain that. Is that the kernel or the seed wherein this nation springs from, something called cultural reference to this?
In fact, I thought I would come to that.
Perhaps explain that. Is that the kernel or the seed
the most important aspect of this springs from, which the Western scholars have given. Of course, these four elements are very important for a nation. The most important, but are they the only important elements the Western scholars have important for a nation? Of course, these four elements are very important. Otherwise, how do you need the most important, but are they the only important elements Westerns that in fact are important for of course these four elements are very important. Otherwise, how do the most important are they the only important elements? Westerns that in fact are important for of course these four elements are very important. Otherwise, how do the most important are they the only important elements? Westerns that in fact are important for of course these four elements are very important. Otherwise, how do the most important are they the only important elements? Westerns that in fact are important for of course these four elements are very important. Otherwise, how do the most important are they the only important elements? Westerns that in fact are important for of course these four elements are very important. Otherwise, how do the most important are they the only important elements? Westerns that in fact are important for of course these four elements are very important. Otherwise, how do the most important are they the only important elements? Westerns that in fact are important for of course these four elements are very important. Otherwise, how do the most important are they the only important elements? Westerns that in fact are important for of course these four elements are very important. Otherwise, how do the most important are they the only important elements? Westerns that in fact are important for of course these four elements are very important. Otherwise, how do the most important are they the only important elements? Westerns that in fact are important for of course these four elements are very important. Otherwise, how do the most important are they the only important elements? Westerns that in fact are important for of course these four elements are very important. Otherwise, how do the most important are they the only important elements? Westerns that in fact are important for of course these four elements are very important. Otherwise, how do the most important are they the only Westerns that in fact are important for of course these four elements are very important. Otherwise, how do the most important are they the only Westerns that in fact are important for of course these four elements are very important. Otherwise, how do the most important are they the only Westerns that in fact are important for of course these four elements are very important. Otherwise, how do the most important are they the only Westerns that in fact are important for of course these four elements are very important. Otherwise, how do the most important are they the only Westerns that in fact are important for of course these four elements are very important. Otherwise, how do the most important are they the only Westerns that in fact are important for of course these four elements are very important. Otherwise, how do the most important are they the only Westerns that in fact are important for of course these four elements are very important. Otherwise, how do the most important are they the only Westerns that in fact are important for of course these four elements are very important. Otherwise, how do the most important are they the only Westerns that in fact are important for of course these four elements are very important. Otherwise, how do the most important are they the only Westerns that in fact are important for of course these four elements are very important. Otherwise, how do the most important are they the only Westerns that in fact are important for of course these four elements are very important. Otherwise, how do the most important are they the only Westerns that in fact are important for of course these four elements are very important. Otherwise, how do the most important So how did these civilizations evolve into nations, keeping the continuity intact? And what is it that determines the continuation of these civilizations? And what is it that prompts them to design themselves into a new nationhood? Is what prompted me to write about this.
Thank you, sir. It's fascinating, and I'm sure it'll be very illuminating to actually arrive at those pearls of wisdom when one goes through the book. And since you spoke of cultural aspects, or the continuity of ingrained continuity of a cultural identity within a people. This is something that I thought I would share with you, which you certainly will be aware of, which also has links to Maharashtra and Jewish identity. And that is one of the, there were, as most of you will be aware, India had a very, very old link with the Jewish diaspora, the Kochini Jews and what we used to call the Baghdadi Jews. But there was a third Jewish community that lived in India that was endemic, or rather that essentially inhabited Maharashtra. And they were called the Beni Israel. The Beni Israel trace their roots back to the time when the destruction of the first temple, they were fleeing from Israel, and they were shipwrecked off the Konkan coast. And a group of these survivors were washed ashore, and they ultimately settled down over there, and over the millennia, they actually they integrated so much into the soil of this nation that they lost their direct Jewish identity, but they retained all the essential cultural practices of Judaism. They still maintained the Shabbat, they still had all the cultural and religious practices that were practiced in Judaism, but they did not have the Torah. Ultimately, somewhere in the mid-17th century, they were rediscovered by a Baghdadi Jew, actually, from erstwhile Bombay Presidency, and reintroduced into the Jewish fold. The interesting thing, of course, about the Beni Israel is that they were, as are most, I wouldn't like to stereotype a community, but they're very intelligent people. And in the entire history of the Jewish diaspora, this was one Jewish community that had a very, very significant presence in the Indian military. Before the British, they served with the Maratha forces, with the Navy, with Shivaji's forces. During the time of the Raj, they served in the armies of the Bombay Presidency, and a disproportionately large number of them would rise to VCO rank. And as a matter of fact, one of them even was awarded what was then the highest award equivalent to the Victoria Cross, which was the Indian Order of Merit. And this is a fact which the state of Israel, or the Jews as a people, take a great deal of pride in, because this is perhaps the only instance in the world where the entire world was persecuting them, that you had Jews that could serve in the ranks as soldiers and live up to their potential and display their thing altogether. General Jacob was a Jew, sir. He was a Baghdadi Jew. As a matter of fact, there is a very famous quip by an American journalist, after 71, when the garrison of East Pakistan, then East Pakistan, had surrendered. And he was standing in front of a TV camera, and he said, the army of Hindu India was commanded by a Parsi, the army commander was a Sikh, and his chief of staff was a Jew. And so, it was basically saying that, what a syncretic culture that this country had. So, Mr. Agarwal, sir, is there anything that you would wish to...
Well, I am a clean slate as far as this history, etc. is concerned. But Jewish people have been prosecuted throughout the history. And I think that is the bond that keeps them together. And I don't know how Israel is keeping them all together. And maybe now with the worldwide this thing, they have distributed all over. And how it will happen in the next 2 or 3 years, 5 years, one doesn't know. In fact, Torah was an old movie that had come, and we all enjoyed. And there are so many Jewish-based movies, that we have enjoyed. So I think you would like to enlighten us on that. Also, whatever aspects you think.
Yeah, that's a very interesting observation. Actually, the Jewish community, we also have to go back into the history of nations. In front of a person who has served his whole life in the army, I'm incompetent to comment on this aspect of the relationship between conflicts, wars, to be more specific, and nationhood. If you see the history of a number of nations, these nations are the result or have formed due to a war. So the outcome of the war determines the nation, or an outcome of a conflict or a revolution, like the French Revolution rewrote the history of the French nationhood. The Boston Tea Party decided the nationhood of so many countries. So these aspects of war, relationship between war and the evolution of nation is there. Very incidentally, before 1948, Israel did not fight even a single war. The Jews never fought a war for themselves. But if you read the history of the formation of Israel, you will find how they have strategized. It was a series of strategies that many Israeli leaders planned and executed. So it was not a war that led, but it was a series of strategic actions. Usually it pains a person like me, and I'm sure my panelists would also agree, that strategy is something that we have been missing for quite a long time. We talk of Chanakya as a strategist. So if I ask you, between Chanakya and 2022, can you name one more strategist? I doubt if anybody would be able to come. The nearest that I can go back to is K. Subramaniam, who was considered to be the foremost strategist of India, father of the present foreign minister. He was considered as a great strategist. So he ingrained this strategic outlook among a lot of people, who are doing research and all like me. So for us, he was a great strategist. But between Chanakya and Subramaniam, why there is not a single strategist? One from Bihar and one from South India. So that links two states of India also. But if you read the history of the Israel, you will see that there have been a series of strategies. Some strategies have gone wrong, some have not gone wrong, some succeeded. There was a time when even the US was not in favor of forming a country called Israel. But how did they beat it? Imagine 75 years back, a set of people who did not have a government, who did not have a country of their own, could strategically outsmart United States at that time. And that was almost the close of the Second World War, where a new world order was being created. So that brings us to the issue that you brought out about the world order. So that is where we have to see. Then in 40s and 50s, there was a new world order. The failure of the League of Nations and the formation of the United Nations, and then a liberal world order as they called it. And then that culminated into a Cold War, the First World War, the Second World War, and then the Cold War. So that world order which started in 1945 has probably led us through a Cold War and has sustained the world order till this time. Now we are all talking in terms of an evolution of a new world order. Of course, that's a different subject. But then in that evolution of a new world order, what role these countries will be playing is a subject of maybe another book.
Thank you, sir. Very quickly, they say, मुल्ले की दौड़ मस्जिद को और फौजी की दौड़ जो है जंग की तरफ होती. So I'll fall back on the, the little knowledge that I have, and that's essentially in the arena of military history. And of course, the Indian Army had a huge role to play insofar as the formation, in purely physical terms, of the state of Israel. Because if you will recall, Palestine was earlier a part of the Ottoman Empire, and during the First World War, the forces that were used to liberate Palestine from the Ottomans, almost 80% of them comprised of Indian soldiers. And as many of you will also remember, a few years ago, the Honorable Prime Minister had rededicated the Teen Murti Memorial in Delhi. It is now known as the Haifa Teen Murti Memorial, in honor of this charge by the 15th Imperial Service Cavalry Brigade, which comprised of the Jodhpur Lancers, the Mysore Lancers, and the Hyderabad Imperial Service Lancers. And this was perhaps the only time that horsed cavalry charged and captured a fortified city. This happened in September 1918, just slightly before the war had ended. So, and that's just a piece of trivia. Oh, and interestingly enough, subsequently when I was writing the history of 61st Cavalry, I came across an anecdote, sir, which may actually be one of the first military actions in the world in support of a Jewish community. And this happened in 22, when a band of Jewish migrants, it was a kafila aa raha tha unka, there was a long column of these Jewish refugees that were moving to settle in Palestine, were being attacked by about 300 armed Arabs, and they were then charged by a troop of about 20 Indian cavalry from 8th Light Cavalry, who then dispersed them and saved the lives of these Jewish settlers. So these are just bits of trivia. So I'm conscious that although we did start a little late, but I would not want to impose upon the organizers. They have a very tight schedule. So I will now, sir, with your permission, throw the floor open. If there's anybody, yes, sir. So may I please request you to state your name and a short question, please. So you, and then, yeah, you, yes, of course. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, sir, please.
What do you think, why has Indian policy in recent years, why has it in frame, for Israel, it has never supported Israel, but for the first time we feel that they are supporting Israel. What is the need? Is there any strategy, this thing behind it, or just, people at the top, they feel that Israel is important to us now? What is the reason?
Oh, that actually this borders on modern geopolitics. So I have not touched the subject of modern geopolitics or current geopolitics in this whole book, of course. But of course, if you go through the book, you would realize the importance of a country called Israel. One thing that I wanted to mention even earlier, in the early 50s and even through 60s, we would, it was, of course, that was a period, I'm post-independence generation, so I can't speak from experience. But people would always say why India has not been able to make a mark, or we have not been able to progress. One of the reason is we have to fight a war. We have an enemy on our western border. We have an enemy on the eastern border. That time, as you said, East Pakistan was still there. So West Pakistan, East Pakistan, we have got China. So these are all the reasons. Constantly fighting a war is one of the reasons why we are not able to make economic progress. Another thing is the weather conditions don't suit us. Sometimes there is heavy rain, the crop is washed off. Sometimes there is no rain, there is drought, there is no crop. And the third is, of course, we are a new country, just we have got independence, so we have to settle our issues and so many other things. If you analyze these three reasons, main reasons, important reasons, if you see, we talk of one country which is inimical to our interest. Imagine a country which is surrounded by enemies. Israel had almost 9 countries which were not just enemies of Israel, but whose single agenda was to finish Israel once and for all. The Arab countries or whatever it is. So you can imagine if that country could make progress, although it was surrounded by enemies who wanted to finish Israel once and for all. We talk of rain and not having rain. Israel is a country which is almost 83% of the country is barren land, desert. And they converted that 83% of barren land, desert into a green pasture. And they started exporting agricultural products. So these reasons cannot be a reason for our backwardness or lack of economic progress. So we have to have a different strategy if you want to have economic progress. And these are all the things that we learn, and that is the reason why India slowly started supporting and coming closer to Israel on so many other aspects. But while doing this, we have not compromised our position vis-a-vis Palestine. And foreign policy is all about balancing, at the same time, safeguarding our national interest. So as long as we are able to safeguard our national interest, but at the same time maintain the balance, we are dealing with the Gulf countries, and at the same time we are dealing with Israel. We are dealing with Russia, and at the same time we are able to have a strategic partnership with US. So these are all some of the things that matter as far as foreign policy is concerned. Of course, we won't go into that subject. It's a very, very difficult and broad subject. And there are people like Professor Khare who are experts on foreign policy. So I shouldn't be talking about foreign policy in front of such people. But suffice to say, these are all the elements that we should remember, and that is why we changed our policy from time to time. And the policy towards Israel did not change now. It continued changing from the time of Dr. P.V. Narasimha Rao, and then Dr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee started it, carried it further. Then Dr. Manmohan Singh carried it much further about that. So it has been an ongoing process from 90s onwards. Sorry.
Sir, please, thank you. Please, so if you could do it, and then that gentleman and the lady, we'll just take 3 questions. Let him ask his question first, and then, sorry? Oh. Okay. Beauty.
Good morning, everyone. I am Kanizara Razavi. I grew up in New York City among many Jews. I am Muslim, and I want to tell you 2 things. And my question is that there is a very important lesson to learn from Israel, and that is integrity of their belief. And I don't mean religion only. I mean from the point of view of a common culture, a common civilization. And the other thing is size, that they can actually put themselves together to do something. We give examples of Singapore being clean and we not being clean. It is not Singapore is clean or Israel is progressive. It is the fact that there is an inner civic commitment. And I would like to ask you, can you see that inner civic commitment happening?
I think you have answered your own question. I shouldn't comment on that. Of course, the point which you raise is very, very valid. Mere religion cannot be the only factor that binds people together. As I said, we should try and understand the difference between these words also, because then we go wrong, very badly we go wrong. So culture is not religion. religion is not dharma, and dharma again is not civilization. So they are all very different words. They have different meanings. Their evolution is different. Their etymological sense is different. So we should not go into these words from a COD point of view. Concise Oxford Dictionary cannot explain and do justice to what we are discussing. But yes, these are all certain areas. I mean, just because you have a strong nation, it need not necessarily mean that you have a great civic sense. Civic sense is something very different. Again, civic sense and the cultural aspects are also, they have some relationship somewhere. So, but yes, your question is very right and very valid also. I mean, this is something that we can inculcate.
Yeah.
That although UK had the bigger role to give geographical location to Israel, yet US is the shield country protecting Israel right now. Why isn't UK very inclined towards Israel as much as US is?
You know, of course, UK was tasked to do that. So the partition resolution which was passed was mainly the idea of UK. You know, Britain was not at the zenith of being a global power at that time. 1946-47, the First World War, America was nowhere. The Second World War, America was practically the leader. So then by that time, the capability of UK to influence world events was slightly reducing. I won't say it was gone, but it was that beginning of the end, you could see. So UK had a task which they had to complete within a particular time period. So they just did not bother what will happen. They just drew a line. They said this area belongs to Israel and this is Palestine. And they left it at that. Just as they say, just as they say about India also, this whole idea of partition was designed by a person who came to India for the first time in his life, and after he came to India he was suffering, and then he did not go out of his room. He took a paper and then he drew a line, and that became the Durand line forever. That became the partition forever. So anyway, I will not go into those history, that's a different story. But this is the reason. And at the end of Second World War, US had started getting into the shoes of being the global cop. So that is where they changed their policies to such an extent that they would get involved with these issues with much greater force.
So the USA siding with Israel is indirectly going against the Muslim world.
That also, no, that is the greatness of their balancing act, A. B, that also has a different strategic outlook as far as Israel is concerned. Their support to Israel and their support to Saudi Arabia could run concurrent to one another. That is the great achievement of the US policymakers, and that is what we are also doing now, in fact.
American support for Israel is not just strategic; it's also political, and there is a reason for that. So you follow the dollar, and there is a very strong, of course, Jewish lobby within the United States, which contributes to their political processes, which is also a very important factor.
There is a very well-known American adage. They say, "Promise me anything but give me money."
Very true. Ji.
I'm Shlok Chandra, and my question is that can you tell us a little about Israeli society? You know, are there any dividing factors? So, for good or for bad, you know, in India we have class, we have religion, we have caste. Say in South Africa and America you have the black versus white divide. Are there any factors which pull the population back? You know, because they've succeeded clearly in the last 50 to 70 years, or is there just a unified population, you know, which has a common goal against Palestine, and that is what is motivating them, or are there any, you know, dividing factors in the population?
So, if I may please request if we can do it quickly, because the organizers have requested.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's a very, very interesting question. I have come to that question almost in the last chapter, and last 2-3 paragraphs I have written. There are certain factors that can harm the formation of the nation and their progress. basically they talk of the first initial 7 tribes. So they still feel that these 7 tribes are more important. So they have this idea of those who, Jewish community which belongs to the part and parcel of the 7 tribes, and the Jewish community which is not part and parcel of the 7 tribe. So that factor, the divisive factor between what you call quote unquote a pure Jew and an impure Jew is still there. It's a very big factor. It's a divisive factor, but they have somehow kept this factor out of political influence. Politically, they don't have this factor contributing. So when it comes to, say, for example, voting a particular candidate, the candidate is not seen as part of the 7 tribe or out of the 7 tribe. That factor is there. So, but your question is very valid, and yes, this could be one of the flashpoints in future if they are not able to address the social aspects in time and they are not able to resolve these conflicts. But I'm sure the national cumulative national strength will be able to address these issues much better. Thank you.
Thank you, discussant, for this wonderful and inspiring discussion. Now, I would like to call on the stage Mrs. Meera Ishwar Das to please come forward and present a memento to our authors and speaker as a token of love, respect, and gratitude combined. And I would also like to invite Ms. Meenakshi Duha on the stage to give a BLF cup to our discussant. The painting is made by Padma Shri Bhuri Bai, an eminent and a fine piece of art. Here is the painting.